Wonderful. Well, welcome, welcome. Again, my name is Shoshana Funk, and I'm the Senior Director of Helping at Jewish for Good. My colleagues here are Stacy, Emily, and Jordana. We're the Helping Department at Jewish for Good. Thank you for joining us for this special program funded in part with grants from the Carolina Foundation for Jewish Seniors and the Leon Levine Foundation. Jewish for Good's Helping Department offers a comprehensive range of services that help people meet life's challenges. We deliver high-quality professional social services for adults and their families through all stages of life. This includes counseling, case management, financial assistance, food pantry, and programs like this one. Much of what we offer is free, and all of it is open to everybody, Jewish or not. For more information, I invite you to visit our website, jewishforgood.org, to look at our upcoming older adult programs we have planned, like Shmuzanash, Care Partner Support Group, and our Memory Cafe program. Additionally, we recently opened an adult day center, the Gindis Adult Day Program. For those interested in learning more, please contact me and I'd be happy to give you more information. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you do want closed captioning or subtitles on the Zoom, you can click on the box at the bottom of the screen that says closed captioning, and then those words will appear. If you haven't already, please change your name in your Zoom screen with whatever you registered with, or you can send a chat with your name and we'll change it for you. So when you registered, if you sent in a question, we have already forwarded those to our speaker today. And those questions should be incorporated into today's content. And if you have questions, which naturally you may as the presentation goes on, we encourage you to either hang on to them or put them in the chat. And then there will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end with our speaker E. And just like the other days, the recording of today's program, along with the slides and further resource links, will be available on our website, and we will share that with you. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our speaker E. This is E. Belleau. The presentation is Why Doesn't Anyone Understand? Unlearning What We Thought We Knew About Grief. So E. Belleau is a social worker, a licensed clinical social worker who uses they, them pronouns, and is the grief outreach coordinator at Transitions LifeCare. E is a licensed clinical social worker with 10 years of experience in grief and end-of-life work. They have extensive experience working with individuals affected by HIV and ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, as well as grief and bereavement, inpatient and home-based hospices. E is a Pennsylvania native, enjoys reading cheesy young adult fiction in their free time, and loves chasing their kiddos and ever-growing collection of dogs around the triangle. So I will toss it over to you, E. Thank you so much for being here today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Shoshana, and thank you all for being here. As Shoshana said, my name is E. Belleau. You did not mishear it. It really is just the letter E, but I am the Grief Outreach Coordinator at Transitions Grief Care, which is a part of Transitions Life Care, or if you have been around the Triangle for a while, you may know us as Hospice of Wake County. But we are a nonprofit that provides hospice, palliative, and grief-centered care to those living in our 8-county service area. And within the bereavement department, we provide grief support to folks who have experienced a death-related loss. And we do that at no cost. We don't require insurance. But to do that, we provide a range of support to folks. It can be anything from direct support to expressive arts, mindfulness-based supports. We do a lot of grief education like I do in my role. We have loss-specific support groups. We even have a grief walk that meets twice a month at the NC Art Museum in Raleigh. But in addition to the offering direct support to grievers, one of my favorite parts of my current job is getting to connect with the community and providing education to folks. I've found personally that aside from providing that direct support to folks who are grieving, one of the most important and helpful things that I can do is to actually educate people on how to support other grievers. because unfortunately we live in a world that doesn't have great language around grief and loss. I teased Stacy earlier when she first asked me to do this talk that it might affect our numbers a little bit because I'm coming in rearing, really eager to talk about suffering and loss. But all jokes aside, truly just want to tell you that I'm so excited to be here and I'm so grateful for each of you for leaning into something that most people turn away from. That is death and dying, grief and loss. I'm going to start out by sharing my screen for a moment. And we'll be providing some information around a wide array of topics today. We'll be starting by talking about what is grief, and maybe even more importantly, what grief isn't. We'll talk a little bit about how it affects our bodies, our minds, our behaviors. From there, I'm going to start talking a little bit about grief theory and models. I promise it won't be too heady, it won't be too cerebral, but I do think it's helpful to just have a bit of context, some foundational understanding of what we're talking about today. And then we'll leave together by talking about holding grief for ourselves, for our neighbors, our communities. And of course, as Shoshana mentioned earlier, there will be time at the end for questions. Certainly feel free to add them to the chat and we'll get to them towards the end. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge that this is a really heavy topic. We're all coming from different places in our lives, different loss histories. So I really want to encourage folks as you're listening to be aware of what's coming up for you and to take care of yourself however you need to in this space. If you need to get up and stretch, if you need to get a glass of water, if you need to turn your camera off, even if you need to hop off entirely and log off, know that you have permission to do that. And know that my hope is that this feels like a safe space to begin to unpack some of these big topics. And if it doesn't feel like the right time, that's okay. Now you've got my information, you know how to find me if and when you do want to explore a little bit further. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So what is grief? Probably sounds like a really absurd question to start with because we're all here for a reason. We've all likely encountered grief in one way or another. But I think there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions around grief that I really want to take some time to unpack and debunk a little bit. But to be able to talk about grief, I think it's actually really important to start by parsing the difference between mourning and grief. These two words that we use pretty interchangeably, but actually refer to two very different experiences. So when we're talking about grief, we're talking about this internal experience, this simple 5-letter word that we're using to explain this cauldron of wide-ranging and wildly ranging experiences. Whereas mourning is external. It's what people see when we're grieving, the memorials, the tears that we cry, the rituals that we engage in. Now, if you can imagine an iceberg like the one on your screen, mourning is maybe 10% of that experience, the things that people see, just the tip of the iceberg. Whereas grief, the bulk of that experience is probably 90% of that experience, but it's hidden beneath the surface. It's just out of sight from the people around us, aside from the person who's experiencing it. And so you may see a griever at the grocery store, or maybe at the parking lot. Maybe they're even at the J getting a workout in. They're out of bed, they're upright. Maybe they've combed their hair or even put on some makeup. And maybe you think to yourself, gosh, they look like they're doing pretty well. They must be okay. But underneath the surface is this churning, ever present, ever evolving experience of grief that we know nothing about because we aren't them and we can't see what's underneath the surface. That's why grief can be so isolating. Even if we ourselves have grieved, we have no idea what that person's grief looks like. Rabbi Earl Grolman says grief isn't a disorder. It's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price that you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. So if we break that down a little bit further, we know that it's not a disease, it's not a disorder. It's a natural human response to something being taken from us. It's what it means to be fully human and to have loved someone so deeply that you want that relationship to continue, even in that grief. And love and grief, they're essentially two sides of the same coin, right? If we love somebody, we're essentially making a pact with grief, knowing that someday that person may be taken from us and we will grieve them. And we can't grieve them unless we first love them. Someone once said that grief is just love with no place to go. As Rabbi Grolman said, the only cure for grief is to grieve. And that is to say that grief is necessary. If we allow ourselves the grace of love, we can also allow ourselves the grace of grief. And he says it's also not a problem to solve. Instead, it's a process to tend to. And it takes a while, and it takes what it takes. There's no timeline on grief. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no ideal time where you should be back to your normal self. And I think most people, we think after 6 months or a year, we should be back to normal. But there's no normal when we're grieving. Normal has been shattered. And it's incredibly individual. No two people grieve alike. Even if we're grieving the same person, that grief is going to look different. For example, if a mother and a child are grieving the death of a husband and a father, that relationship was different when that person was living. And so our grief is going to look different as well. So much about our grief is all about attachment, attachment to that person when they were living, desire to remain attached even in their death. And I often, when people ask me, how long should I be feeling like this? I talk a lot about overlapping circles, this idea of overlapping. So if you can imagine this is your person and this is you, how much of your life overlapped with them or intersected with them? So maybe a neighbor and you, maybe you saw each other at functions or when you took the dog out to walk. It overlapped some, of course. But think about maybe a child and a parent that almost completely intersected. That's not to say that that's an exact prediction of what that grief will look like, but it helps us to better understand the fact that our grief is all about attachment and the ways in which it shows up, the symptoms that we experience, the acute level of grief that we experience is very much about how much our lives intersected. And it's also this process of beginning to internalize that relationship and again, remaining connected to them long after that person has died. If you've ever read Mitch Albom's Tuesdays with Morrie, he says death ends a life, not a relationship. I think what he means by that is that idea of internalizing what was once an external relationship. That person that maybe you called on the way home from work every day. How often do we still pick up the phone and try to dial their number? Right? We find new ways to remain connected to them. Maybe that's through still talking to them at the end of the day, or we find other rituals. And that's something I'll build on in a little bit. But again, it's this idea of internalizing what was once a physical or external relationship. And it's also this process of shifting our awareness from everything that has been taken from us, everything that's been stolen, to everything that remains because that person existed. And because of that loss and the ways in which our lives intersected, it affects every part of our being, our bodies, our minds, our behaviors, our spirits. And it also affects our current version of ourselves, our past version, and our future version of ourselves. And so I want to talk a little bit about this current version of us, our now selves, because if you are here and you are grieving or have grieved, it's likely that you don't or didn't recognize that version of yourself. So I have normal grief reactions stated here. I don't love the word normal when it comes to much of anything, but especially with grief, it feels really trivializing. But all that to say is these reactions that we're going to talk about are just to say that you are not going crazy. It may feel like you are losing your mind, you are losing yourself, but these experiences are all within the depth of grief. And so I want to start out by talking about what has changed emotionally. And I'm going to ask you to use the chat if you're able and comfortable to. We're going to go briefly through these, and I've got a long list on my next slide, but I want to crowdsource a little bit to see what folks feel or recall feeling in the group that we have here today. So, thinking about your most recent grief experience, what do you remember feeling emotionally? We know there's sadness, but there's so much more than that. Can you use the chat and maybe add what other feelings you remember feeling when you were grieving? Other than sadness, the helplessness. Yeah, absolutely. A deep sadness. Yeah. Somebody once said, I thought I knew sadness until I felt this sadness. Anger, betrayal, regret, anxiety, resentment. Absolutely. Being under a dark cloud. That's such a visceral explanation. Thank you. Yeah. I want to go back to Chantel. You wrote anger. When folks felt anger with grief, what often comes after that? In those moments after you feel anger? Guilt. Yep, that's what I was looking for. Shame. Absolutely. These feelings of guilt and regret and shame. Absolutely. I haven't seen this yet, and I try to wait to see if anybody mentions it before I throw it out there. There it is, Cheryl. Thank you. What about relief? Yeah, relief, that word that feels so taboo and so scary to say out loud. And often it's followed by guilt and shame. Yeah, how often we feel relief sometimes, especially if we were caregivers, that physical and emotional burden of caregiving, or the fact that that person is no longer in physical pain. It certainly doesn't remove the feelings of grief and loss, but that feeling of relief is so real. Thank you for naming it. About physical changes, what do you remember feeling physically? What was happening in your body or is happening in your body? Yep, loss of appetite, absolutely. Sometimes increased appetite. Anybody else? Extreme tiredness, yeah. Not just tired, but bone tired. Exhaustion, tension, absolutely. Lack of motivation, certainly. Hard to get out of bed, hard to follow through, nauseous, unable to function. Yeah. Knots in stomach, distracted, absolutely. Yeah. Another one, if you've got physical issues already, physical ailments, how often they are exacerbated when we're grieving. Again, especially if you were a caregiver. It's a really physically demanding role. And often we tend to put our own needs aside when we're caring for someone else. Shoshana, you mentioned distractible, that fits in physical, and then what I was going to ask next about mentally, cognitively. So getting distracted. What else has changed with your mind, your brain? How many of you have walked into a room and forgotten why you entered into it? See some nods. Yeah. Yeah. See, someone wrote, I'm finding something interesting. I've not had grief I've not had grieving in a very long time. As a result, I'm unable to imagine many of the terms and emotions. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe have had some space since that time. It's hard to put ourselves back in that space willingly and remember what we felt. Judith, more forgetful, mixed up. Absolutely. All these things that I lovingly refer to as grief brain, right? So much about grief is just about survival, trying to get through 15 minutes at a time. And so a lot of these things go to the back burner. More irritable, absolutely. And with irritability, what have you noticed about behavioral changes, the ways that you interact with the world around you? More irritable, maybe a shorter fuse, hesitant to enjoy things. Absolutely. We'll get to that in a little bit too, Judith. Yeah. Hard to enjoy the things around you. I saw lots of appetite earlier. Changes to sleep patterns, maybe. Withdrawing, absolutely. Isolation, maybe having more fights with people around you. And how about spiritual? And when I say spiritual, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious or dogmatic, though it could, but that idea of something greater than us, that existential part of us. How do you remember changing? What kind of questions you remember asking yourself? Those big questions. Yeah, I see feeling like you were able to channel your husband. Absolutely. Things like visitations, dreams. I'll talk a little bit more about channeling our people in a little bit too. You're hitting all the right points, Judith. Yeah. What about our sense of identity, our sense of purpose, of meaning that changes when somebody we love dies? So often we reflect upon ourselves and our identity as almost a mirror of our person, right? And how often we think, gosh, I don't know who I am anymore without my person. Wanting answers, absolutely. Yeah, all of these things. Well, as I mentioned, I've got a little diagram here, and I think most of you hit upon all the big ones. But we could continue on indefinitely with this diagram, and everyone's diagram would look so differently. But the reason that I wanted us to go through this just for a moment is because it directly reflects back on that iceberg image that we talked about earlier. So, mourning, the external part of our grief, is all of 10% of the experience. It's the tip of the iceberg. But this on your screen, this is the bulk of the experience. And so much of it is below the surface. This is what people don't see when they expect us to return to work 3 to 5 days of bereavement leave or later, or wonder why we're not acting like our normal selves. This is the real image of grief. And one of the things that many of you touched upon was this idea of our brains being affected. I don't know if you remember the 90s. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on grief, right? One of the many things that people say is greatly impacted by grief is our brain and how it functions. What I, again, lovingly refer to as grief brain. So much about grief is about survival, just getting through the next 15 minutes or one breath to the next. So when your dentist appointment was, why you walked into that room, where you put your keys, unless you're being chased, it's really not about survival. And so these things, they get pushed to the back burner, they get forgotten. And a common question that grievers ask me is, why am I still hurting so badly? Why am I still grieving a year or 2 years or 5 years later? And part of this question can be really beautifully summed up by the work of Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. She has a phenomenal book called The Grieving Brain. It's a little bit heady, but I'm going to try to break down some of the studies that she mentions. But she performed this study using mice, where she was measuring the neural pathways of mice when she put them into this maze. She then made a Lego tower and dropped it into the maze, and again, measured the neural pathways of their brains. After some time, she took that Lego tower out, and one more time measured the neural pathways of the mice to try to figure out how long it would take for them to forget that Lego tower existed. So my question to you, and again, feel free to use the chat, how long do you think it took for the mice to forget a piece of plastic, this plastic Lego tower? Give me your best guess in the chat. Come on, Shoshana. An hour, okay. Anybody else? All right. Shoshana has brave never. Okay. Good, good guess. So I've got an hour, never, 3 days. All right. So you ready for the answer? It took these mice 11 days to forget about a piece of plastic. So let's go back to that original question that I asked. Why am I still grieving a year, 2 years, 5 years later? So if we think about this, multiply that 11 days by relationships that are built up over time, the emotions, the joys, the intimacy, the years, and the fact that you are not a mouse. That's why grief takes so long. And our grief is not something that we get over. There's no timeline on grief. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's only your way. And Dr. O'Connor, she has another anecdote that I really love, but to understand her anecdote, you have to first accept this premise. And it's a little bit silly, but hear me out. So her premise is your kitchen table has been stolen. So you wake up in the middle of the night, you're thirsty, so you walk down the stairs and go into the kitchen to get a drink. It's completely dark, and you recognize not the presence of something, but the absence of something. So the corner of that table that maybe used to brush up on your hip bone, or that leg table that you'd always stub your toe on every morning, it's gone. And it's in the absence that we recognize that we're walking in two worlds simultaneously. This virtual reality map that is stored in our brain, and the physical reality in which that table is gone. And Dr. O'Connor, she says, grief is a heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve. And grieving necessitates learning to live in the world with the absence of someone you love deeply, who's ingrained in your understanding of the world. And this means that your brain, your loved one, is simultaneously gone and also everlasting. And you're walking through two worlds at the same time. You're navigating your life despite the fact that you have had something stolen from you, a premise that makes no sense and that is both confusing and upsetting. And she says we're essentially being asked to throw out the map that we have used to navigate our lives and to start transforming that relationship with the person who's died. And she says grieving or learning to live a meaningful life without the physical form of your loved one is ultimately a form of learning. And as we just showed on that diagram, the things that make learning hard make grieving hard. Things like low motivation, distractions, difficulty concentrating, lack of pleasure, physical pain, discomfort. And it's likely that you have never done this before. Even if you've grieved in the past, you've never grieved this relationship before. And part of coming to understand and acknowledge that grief is naming and understanding the many layers that we experience after the death of somebody we love. And we often refer to these layers of loss as secondary losses. And that's not to say that these losses are less important or they're any less painful, but rather they came after that first physical loss of your person. And that one loss, the death of your person, it bubbles out and creates all of these connections and touches every part of your life, your being. And so, again, many people, think or mistake that physical loss as the only loss, but there also are tangible losses. For example, if a parent dies and you're forced to maybe sell your childhood home, or your spouse dies and you're forced to move to a new city or a new community, these are all really physical, tangible losses that you can name. On the other hand, many times grievers will say, I feel so lost now. I don't know who I am anymore. Or who am I without this person? What's my meaning? And these are intangible losses. And these intangible losses, like one's identity, can often be a loss in and of themselves. But grievers also feel the loss of the role that their loved one played, right? Maybe it was a constant companion. Maybe it was a loss of intimacy. Maybe it was the handyman or the person who took out the trash. These are all losses in their own right. But unfortunately, we don't live in a world that knows how to acknowledge these losses. We don't have language for it. Fun fact about me, my very first job as a kid, I worked at Hallmark. And so I am intimately aware of all of the unique ways you can offer sympathy or condolences to somebody after a death. But not once have I ever picked out a card that said, I'm sorry for your loss of intimacy, or I'm sorry for the loss of your fundamental belief system. These cards don't exist. I will say my colleagues and I, my art therapist friends, we have considered having another career and an alternative card organization for alternative experiences. So just keep an eye on that for the future. But again, these losses, they are incredibly personal and sometimes private. And so they can be really difficult to get and give support around them. And it's likely that we are grieving many losses, not just one, right? It's not just a whole, it's Swiss cheese. Grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in isolation. One loss can bring about memories from past losses. And so we're not just grieving the present, we're grieving everything that came before and everything that could have been in the future. So now that we have a better understanding of how grief impacts us, I want to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about grief theory. Again, I promise it won't be too heady, but I think it's really important to have some context for understanding grief. But before I advance the slide, again, feel free to use the chat function. I want to ask folks, when you think about grief theory or grief theorists, what's the first theory that usually comes to mind? Or the one theorist that comes to mind? I'll give you a hint. It's got a number in it. Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Yep. Thank you, Chantel. You are correct. All right. So Chantel is the winner. They guessed Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, The 5 Stages of Grief. So whenever I do these talks, almost invariably somebody asks, what about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 5 Stages of Grief? You haven't talked about that yet. And I take a deep breath and I brace myself because it's not what people think it is. So with that being said, I am going to talk about 5 stages of grief. So 5 stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. We all know the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What most people don't know is that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross would probably be rolling in her grave if she knew how we were reappropriating her theory, because she didn't make it for us. She didn't write this theory for people who are grieving. She wrote it for people who are dying. I'm going to pause there for a minute to let that sink in. She wrote this theory for people who are dying. So if you can imagine this linear process, clear end, start, clear end. You're born, you live, at some point you perhaps get sick or have an accident and die. That's a linear process. Clear start, clear end. But what we've been talking about with grief is that our grief doesn't end with death. It goes and goes and goes. So what happens to us over here if this is the model that we've been given? Again, I think people see this model, this model that we hear about in media and in literature. It's all we really are given. And we feel really isolated, right? We think, okay, I thought I was over anger and closer to acceptance, but now I'm pissed off again. What am I doing wrong? How am I doing this wrong too? And it leaves us feeling even worse and even more isolated in our grief. And while we still refer to this model, it portrays this linear model of grief that really isn't accurate because grief is nonlinear. I think this image does a really good job of explaining what I mean by that. So on the left is a linear model, how we want grief to work. We want a clear start, a clear end. If we're lucky, maybe some helpful mile markers in between to let us know we're going at the right pace, that the finish line is near. But in reality, our grief looks more like the image on our right, a clear start and an arrow pointing forward, up and down and all over the place. It probably looks a lot like if you've ever gotten a necklace or a chain tangled up in knots. We know that the more that we tug, the more that we pull on it to try to untangle it, the tighter those knots become. It's in the slowing down and those intentional movements, that suspension, that we're able to pull apart those layers and make sense of what we're holding. And the same is true of grief. We need that suspension. And we also need to acknowledge that this is a forever process, though our relationship to that grief will change. So you may be wondering, okay, E, if we're not using 5 stages of grief, what are you leaving me with? And there are a lot of models and theories of grief out there, and not all are created equal. One that we most frequently ascribe to at the Grief Center is William Worden's 4 Tasks of Mourning. The beautiful thing about this is that the tasks are not linear. You can jump around, you can work on multiple tasks at once, and it allows us to meet folks where they are in their grief, however they are in their grief. And so there are 4 tasks, not particularly in this order, but one is accepting the reality of the loss. Again, if you've not grieved before, that might seem like a silly premise. This person has died. Of course, that's real. But again, how many times do we pick up the phone and start dialing their number before we realize they won't pick up? Again, why the further away from the death, it sometimes gets a little bit harder the further we get from that sense of reality. And 2, processing the pain of grief. That's a lot of what we do in grief counseling, the retelling of stories, figuring out the narrative, maybe making meaning of what we've experienced. The third is adjusting to a world without the person who's died. Again, referring to that idea of living in 2 realities, one in which they are physically gone, and one in which they are forever a part of us in our hearts and in our minds. And the fourth is finding an enduring connection with a person who's died while embarking on a new life. Maybe that's through talking with our person or finding rituals that feel meaningful for us. And these are all things that we're going to talk about in just a moment. With that being said, I want to shift into holding grief now that we have some context for better understanding what it is that we are holding and how to navigate it. And I think the most important thing, the most important guidance that I can give to folks is just as we don't stop loving our people after they've died, we don't stop grieving either, which can be a really scary premise, especially if you're really early in the grief process. But our relationship to our grief does change. And the key to accepting this reality, if you are comfortable using that word accepting, is to actually do nothing with what we're experiencing. That is not resisting the pain of grief, which I know is really counterintuitive in the Western world because we love to fix things. But we know grief isn't something we can fix, it's something we have to carry. And I think for many grievers, we sit in one of 2 groups. We may feel stuck in our grief with this fear that if I'm not outwardly grieving, if I'm not mourning, people will think I'm over it. And so we begin to experience this deep grief coupled with the guilt of what it might look like if I start to laugh or if I sometimes forget for even a moment my reality. Or On the other side, we busy ourselves to avoid the pain, to numb it. And the truth is that we actually need both of these things. We need the grief work and the distraction. And if you can imagine an old school oscillating fan, and if you have been at the J over the last 2 weeks, I know you're familiar with fans, but we need this back and forth, this ebb and flow of grief and the things that we need to do to continue living in this new world. And I would be remiss if I didn't pause here for a moment to just gently remind anyone who needs to hear this that pleasure and joy, they do not mean forgetting your person. Feelings like joy and laughter, they actually help to expand our coping. And while guilt is common in grief, several of you named that earlier, laughing and enjoying yourself does not mean that you are over it or that you're forgetting them. It means that you are choosing to stay here, to wade through the yuck of grief while allowing yourselves the grace of joy in whatever form it comes as you are navigating the world in your grief. And with that, I want to make just a brief note about suffering and pain. Again, much like mourning and grief, we use these words interchangeably, but pain is something we can't remove from somebody. We can band-aid it, we can give them some Tylenol, but we can't cure it. We can care for it. And when we attempt to try to take somebody's pain from them, their grief from them, we're actually taking everything that's connected to that grief, the love, the memories, their inherent right to be able to grieve. Suffering, however, can be eliminated or at least reduced. There's an old proverb that says, a joy shared is doubled, a grief shared is half. And so, how do we do that? How do we begin to reduce suffering? And Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, the author of The Grieving Brain, she lays out 8 different techniques, and I wanted to go through those. And the first is retelling our story. Again, many of us have this natural, instinctive need to review all of the details with a magnifying glass and ask ourselves these big questions. Things like, did I make the right decision? Did I do all that I could or should have done? And the common experience in grief, as we've talked about, is that feeling of guilt or regret. And these feelings are a really heavy burden to carry around. And this retelling or reappraisal or reevaluating can actually sometimes reduce those feelings of suffering by reducing feelings of guilt to what they actually are most of the time, which is regret. We can say, yes, I wish that the outcome had been different. And no, I didn't have control. I didn't have the resources to be able to change the outcome. Guilt is, I knew this is wrong and I did it anyway. Whereas regret is, I wish I could have changed this. And if I had the resources and information I have now, I would have. And sometimes using that magnifying glass, it allows us to reduce that guilt to feelings of regret. And it allows us to be able to move forward and inform our future, our relationships with that information. And the retelling can also allow us to gain insight into our values, which can also be a huge part of regaining that sense of identity that often we lose when we're grieving. The second that she mentions is distraction or avoidance. I think many of us hear those words and we automatically think that they're negative, but they don't necessarily have to be. An example of avoidance that I often hear with grievers is, I went to the grocery store 10 miles away from my house so that I didn't have to bump into anybody that I knew. I didn't have to retell my story. I didn't have to explain why my person wasn't here shopping with me today. Other people throw themselves into work or keep company with Netflix at nighttime. Distraction and avoidance can actually be a really healthy part of the grieving process, as long as that fan keeps oscillating. Another is celebrating and savoring, exactly what it sounds like. Remembering the good memories, sharing favorite stories, maybe cooking a meal that your person loved, really savoring those memories and sensations. I think it was Judith who mentioned channeling her husband earlier. And a word that we love to use and an exercise that I do with a lot of folks is this idea of conjuring, which sounds a little doo-doo-doo-doo. But it's this idea of using all of our senses to try to conjure or channel, if you will, our person. Maybe that's spraying their perfume or their cologne on a pillow, or if they have a schmata that they gave you, that tactile sensation. Maybe it's making a meal that reminds you of them, that sensory information. Again, using those senses to conjure their presence, to feel closer to you. Another is phone a friend. Somebody once told me, don't go to Home Depot to buy bread, which I think was just their way of saying, if you need somebody to just listen to you and hold space, maybe don't go to Uncle Wayne over here that just wants to crack a joke and distract you. But identifying maybe what some of our main needs are, and it's okay if you don't know, and identifying who the people we trust are. Who can we call on to meet some of those needs? Again, you don't go to Home Depot to buy bread. The next is soothing or seeking comfort. And this can take so many different forms, from a hug to a hot shower. For those of you who mentioned having a hard time with appetite, do me a favor. Next time you take a hot shower, bring an orange with you. Bear with me. It is a snack, it's an activity, and it's aromatherapy. And you will be distracted enough with the water that you might be able to get at least a piece or two in your system. Another little tip while you're in the shower, for folks who are struggling with motivation, especially around hygiene. Gentle reminder that you don't have to wash your hair every time you take a shower. It is enough to just lay on the bathtub floor and let the water drip over you. These things are enough. Again, these things, they don't change the outcome. They don't bring our people back, but sometimes they allow us to feel even a little bit more human in the process. Another is peer support or social modeling, surrounding yourself by people who get it. Maybe a guide or a Sherpa, if you will, somebody who's just a few steps ahead of you in their grief, so they can point out some of those landmines and hold space. Something as validating as just, yeah, this is really that hard. And no, you're not crazy. It can be so validating and nourishing. Another is religious coping or memorializing, meditating. For some, maybe that's yahrzeit or prayer or meditation. My son is Mexican, and so one of our rituals is to have an ofrenda or an altar up year round, where we have photos of the people we love who've died. And on special holidays, we put out fun little treats that we know that they would have liked. Again, that idea of conjuring, just inviting them back into this space with us. And finally, expression. Maybe that's through journaling, screaming, crying, ripping up paper. Fun fact, not as destructive as it sounds. When you rip up paper, it actually does this really neat thing in your brain and stimulates something called bilateral stimulation, which aids healing. It can reduce physiological and emotional arousal. So ripping paper, going on a walk, all of these things. So with expression, there are actually two really beautiful opportunities on our campus that transitions for expression. One is the cosmic post on the left. And essentially we have folks write a letter or scribble or draw, whatever your mode of communication, and they can lift up the flap of that post box. You put it in, close it. There's a wick underneath that you light, and it creates ash and smoke of your words, and it billows out through those tubes at the very top. It's just this beautiful way of being able to communicate with your person who doesn't have a physical address anymore. This idea of ritual of release. The other is called the wind phone. This is our recently dedicated wind phone on campus. And essentially it's this little vestibule that looks over NC State's campus, the pastures that are on our campus. It's far enough away that we cannot hear you talking. If you talk, or even if you scream lightly, we won't be able to hear you. So you are free to communicate with your person, but you are able to sit at that vestibule. There's a telephone that is not connected, but you can pick it up and just talk to your person. Maybe these are words that you wish you could have said, or keeping them up to date on what's been going on since they've been gone. Again, two really unique opportunities on campus for expression. I know some of you are here looking for information. How do I support the people around me, my friends, my neighbors, my community? And so I wanted to offer some pretty practical tips to be able to support other people. But before we do that, I think there's some internal work that we have to do before we can begin to hold others' pain. And the first is mindful self compassion. That's just a fancy way of saying taking care of yourself. There's a Buddhist proverb that says if your compassion doesn't include yourself, it's incomplete. That is to say that this is really hard work, even if you're doing this as a layperson. It's a really heavy burden to carry, and it impacts all of us in different ways. And so being gentle on yourself, maybe being mindful of the expectations of you that you have of yourself when you're doing this work, and building community, connecting with other people who are supportive. We all need somebody behind us. And then next is grounding exercises, just finding ways to take care of yourself, finding meaningful and restorative practices that allow you to come back and continue to support people. A couple of examples that I've used in my own work when I worked at Duke at the inpatient unit. Um, I would have long days, 10 hours, 12 hours. And so I would often wear this little cardigan. And so I would drive up to work, I would go to my trunk, and I would pull out my cardigan and I would put it on. I would go into the hospice house, do what I needed to do. I would come back, take the cardigan off, and I would fold it up and put it back in my trunk. And this was just to say that, and first of all, for y'all who are thinking this, I promise I washed it at least once a week. But it was just this way of saying, I am choosing to put this on. I'm choosing to take on this role and to hold this for other people. And now I need to put it down because it's too heavy for me to bring home. That being said, we don't live in an ideal world. I, of course, take things home sometimes. Another practice that I would do at home is I would have this really fragrant wood that I would light and I would hold it and put it in a bowl. And as the smoke billowed up, I would just allow any thoughts or images or names or stories that have been shared with me to come up with that smoke. And I would try not to judge them as they came, but just to name them and notice them. And when that smoke was done, I would tap the wood out and I would put it back on the shelf. Again, just being able to create this container so that I wasn't carrying it around everywhere with me. But these things, I really want to encourage you to take up space in your grief and in your helping. We all need that space. It's not selfish. In fact, it actually expands our capacity for compassion. And finally, cognitive reframing. Again, that's just a fancy way of saying changing the way that we think about things. And that might be as simple as telling ourselves that my job is not to fix this. Instead, it's to acknowledge and attend and listen to this person. And even if it doesn't feel great to me, I'm successful if I'm doing these things. Or not being able to fix or alleviate pain. It doesn't mean that I'm doing something wrong. Again, we can't fix grief. A few more practical tips. Appreciating vulnerability. That can be as simple as saying, thank you so much for telling me that. Thank you for trusting me. Owning the reality. I know there's nothing that I can do or say to fix this. And I really want to encourage you to embrace the word and here. I think we tend to use the word but, which negates the first half of the sentence, but embracing the and. So I know there's nothing I can do or say to fix this, and I want to support you in any way that I can. Acknowledging the gravity of the loss, matching colorful language. If somebody says, this really sucks, it's okay to say, yeah, this really sucks. It's okay to be their mirror. It's okay to use colorful language. If somebody refers to what they experienced as traumatic, it was traumatic. It's okay to name that. And finally, invite sharing. Would you like to tell me more? I'm here to listen if it would be helpful. Even just saying that person's name can be such an incredible joy and relief to know that it's not a burden. They don't have to be the one to bring it up. And lastly, don't rush to fix. There's another really wonderful book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. She says some things can't be fixed, they can only be carried. Grief is one of those things. And it's okay to ask. Often you can help just by genuinely acknowledging that loss and the pain that that person is going through without judgment, without trying to hasten the process. Again, you might think that saying that person's name or bringing it up might cause that person pain. But the reality is that pain is already there. You are not causing them pain. What you're doing is you're actually providing them the opportunity to begin to release some of that. Again, going back to that proverb, a joy shared is doubled, a grief shared is half. And it's okay to feel awkward. When in doubt, listen. Oftentimes, rather than finding the right words, and there really aren't any right words, listening communicates that you accept that person where they are, that you care for them. And your job, should you choose to accept it, is to feel awkward and stay there anyway. Hang out in their pain. And if things get dark, and they may, it's okay. Allow them to feel dark. We don't need to shed a flashlight into that corner. And finally, listening and mirroring. Megan Devine says that good things and horrible things, they take up the same amount of space. They don't cancel each other out. Sadness is actually really healthy. And so being your person's mirror, again, when they say, this is really hard, it's okay to say, yeah, this is really hard. That may sound like an oversimplification, but it can be such a huge benefit to just have somebody to sit with you who doesn't try to change how you're feeling, that will just sit there with you. And the last slide for you all, I wanted to share this image because I think it just sums up our whole conversation today around grief. It says, people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. And there will be days like holidays and birthdays and random Wednesday mornings when that shaded part, that grief, feels like it takes up every inch of that space. But eventually our world does begin to grow around it. I want to thank you all for taking time to hear from me. I know I've talked at you for quite a bit. I tried to integrate some of the questions that were asked previously, but just want to open up to see if there are any questions that I can support folks around.
Thank you so much, E. It's really so many things. I know I will be coming back to the slides and to this video because there's so many wonderful tidbits and larger concepts that you've shared. Somebody said that they read Kubler-Ross during a very difficult move, and it helped me to understand what I was feeling was grief and to recognize the phases, which gave me hope of getting beyond it. So sort of touching on that sense of grief beyond losing a person and sort of the other ways that we might grieve or other things we might grieve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And grief, my work is around death-related loss, but that's absolutely right, Jean. We experience so much grief anytime that a part of us or a part of our world is taken, often without our consent. I'm so glad that that was helpful.
Does anyone else have any questions or things that they would want to share with E and with the group? You can see if a lot of people are getting a lot out of this, so that's nice to see.
Yeah. See, from Judith, can you talk a bit about triggers? I've been having what some call grief bursts periodically, and I can usually pinpoint triggers. Yeah, absolutely, Judith. That is such a huge part of the grief experience. When I was talking earlier about peer support and having a guide or a Sherpa. I think I mentioned landmines, and that's exactly what I mean by that. These landmines or triggers that, it can be anything as obvious as driving past their house, or I'm in the grocery store, I'm having one of those good days that are few and far between. I'm checking things off my list, and then suddenly I walk down the snack aisle and I see their favorite snack and realize I don't have to put that on my grocery list anymore, right? Or a smell. Sometimes we don't even know what the triggers are until it hits us, and we feel this physical sensation. Yeah, yeah. I think being able to name some of those triggers can be really helpful, not necessarily in avoiding them, but being able to name them and acknowledge, again, no, I am not crazy. This is very much a part of the grief experience, and it's physical and emotional and spiritual and psychological. Even my brain has been rewired in my grief. So of course these things are triggering it.
Roxanne shared similar to sort of the study on the mice,
Mhm.
that one of her cats died and the surviving cat exhibited such grief for a year.
Yeah,
It's
that's
not
so
just
real. It's so real. Yeah, I hear that a lot, even in hospice. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a family or somebody who is dying, and they brought their pet in to come visit them in the hospice house, and afterwards, on the bereavement side of things, they would share how the dog responded to that person no longer physically being in the home, and very real experiences of grief, again, that we know nothing about, aside from these mice, of course, that we studied those pathways. Yeah.
I know you touched on this in terms of sort of the loss of intimacy, some of the sort of secondary losses, but I worked with a client who lost a spouse, and she really had a hard time with the sensory deprivation.
Mm.
And so one of the things she did was to go get massages or just
Yep.
find ways to get more physical contact,
Mm.
because that was something that was really difficult for her. So I don't know if I know you gave lots of like tips and tricks, but are there other um things that you would encourage someone who's struggling with the sort of that loss of
Yeah.
touch?
Yeah, absolutely. And oddly enough, the massage piece is one that I've used personally,
Mhm.
looking to just receive that physical touch and feel safe and nurtured in a way. I think I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier about, we don't go to Home Depot to buy bread, and being able to name what are some of those needs. And one of them might be that physical touch. An exercise that I often do with grievers is having them talk about what I need from you is dot dot dot, or what people don't understand dot dot dot, and filling in those prompts, and then going through and writing a list of everyone that you have access to, anyone who anchors you, anyone that you could potentially call on, trying not to censor yourself, and then going through that list and writing down, is that person somebody that I would need to listen to me, or to do something physical, tangible for me, or to distract me? Are they a listener, a doer, or a respite giver? And being able to name, who could I even go to for some of these needs? If that need is physical touch, are there people on this list that I have access to? People that I would feel safe going to get that physical touch. Um, this is something that I also talk about with folks that I'm counseling, um, is this idea of havening. So it's not something you would receive from another person, but can also help with that physical touch, and it also stimulates bilateral stimulation. It's called havening. It's essentially giving yourself a little hug at the elbows, and you want to go all the way up to your shoulders and all the way down to your hands. Just try not to break contact, almost like you're cold, and just trying to warm yourself up. It's this idea of havening, but again, it can reduce physiological and emotional distress that stimulates bilateral stimulation, which can also aid in healing. So again, not something that you would ask of somebody else, but something that you can even do on your own. And even in public, right? You can just tell people you're cold. They won't think anything of it.
That's really nice. Anyone else have any follow-up questions or thoughts that they want to share before we end today? Well, I just want to say thank you again so much to you, E, for, yes, the work that you do and for sharing so much today with us. It was really, really wonderful. As folks know, we will be having our final day tomorrow. I think it'll be a nice follow-up to today. It's about yoga for healthy aging. So we look forward to that tomorrow at 10:30. We will send the link out in the morning. And we will send an evaluation out at the end of this week. And this recording will be published on our website. I'm just grabbing the link and putting that in the chat here. So probably by the end of next week, everything will be uploaded on our website. There are some local resources as well that we wanted to share, including Growing Through Grief, which is a group for folks who are grieving, and it's sort of a psychoeducational model. It meets every Tuesday. It's on our events calendar here at Jewish for Good. It's an interfaith program. And there's also a local organization called Grieve Leave. So those are things that we can upload onto our website in addition to the other resources that are there. And certainly Transitions LifeCare, you can contact any one of us for additional resources in the area if you are looking.
So much, Shoshana.
All right, well, thank you all for being here today. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning. And thank you again to E. E, if you want to stay on for 1 minute while folks sign off. I see lots of hearts. It's very, very nice. I will end our recording as well.